Hello, Rune Scholar, wherever and whenever you are. I'm the Modern Erilar. So far on my channel, I've discussed the Anglo-Saxon Futhark and Younger Futharks from the Isle of Man in Orkney and by request in Ireland. But I haven't yet done an episode on the runes from Jorvik, the Viking settlement at York. So today, and also by request, let's discuss runes from the Danelaw. The Danelaw was settled by an influx of Scandinavians between the late 9th and 11th centuries, the first waves of which are often referred to as the Great Heathen Army. Based on onomastic or place name evidence, the Scandinavian settled area seems to have comprised Leicester, Nottingham, Derby, Lincoln, York, Essex, Cambridge, Suffolk, Northampton, Norfolk, Huntingdon, Bedford, Middlesex, Hertford, and Buckinghamshire. In this part of what is now England, the Danes were allowed to keep their own laws in the areas in which they settled, and many place names indicate that they kept their own language alive in this area as well, at least much more so than in the south and the west of England. So if they spoke Old Danish in the Danelaw, did they also write in runes? Well, probably, but nearly all of the inscriptions, at least from the northwest of England, all of those are dated after the Norman Conquest. Scandinavian runic inscriptions in northern England on stone also tend to be associated with ecclesiastical sites, though runes do survive on other materials as well. We don't have a huge number of surviving inscriptions, but between Mercia and Northumbria, there are 15 Younger Futhark inscriptions in the runes database from the Academy of Sciences Göttingen, or the runesdb.de. I'll describe several of the inscriptions that are both substantive and intelligible, and try to treat them in the order in which they have been dated. From the settlement at York, we do have some runes, but not many. We have a wooden spoon with 2 runes from the Anglo-Scandinavian period of colonization, and these are generally interpreted as the Anglo-Saxon runes Ken and Ailsedge, which transliterate to C and X, possibly indicating in this combination the name for Christ. So while York became a very important center for Scandinavian colonization in the Danelaw, these don't seem to be Scandinavian runes. We do have other inscriptions from this time period from York at St. Mary Castlegate, for example, but that inscription is in a mixture of Old English and Latin, and it's in a bookhand. It's not in runes. So while there has been a great deal of rescue archaeology in York over the last several decades, maybe we just have to wait for additional runic finds. A cattlebone comb case from Lincoln is now stored at the British Museum, and they date this find to the 10th century. The inscription looks very much like an ad, as it tells us that Thorfaster made a good comb. Its runes are long branch with a double barred O rune, where the branches fully cross the stave, and the rune writer also used a ride rune to end the name Thorfaster instead of an ir rune, which is interesting. In Norway and Norwegian settled areas, the final R evolved from the palatal r sound of Elder Futhark into a regular R sound very quickly. So the ir rune did become redundant, and the regular writhe rune was used even at the end of words. We know this sound change could have occurred as early as the 10th century, since the Anglo-Saxon and the Danish rune poems tell us that the rune was called ir and what it sounded like, but the first Norwegian instance that we see of writhe replacing ir is from the second quarter of the 11th century, and from there it eventually spread to the rest of Scandinavia. So Either this is an innovation in the Atlantic colonies that came to Scandinavia, or we need another way to validate the 10th century date of this object, because an ending raid rune may more reasonably indicate a date in the 11th century. But I'm open to a good argument. Noticed in 2014 at Sockburn Hall, Northumbria, we have an inscription on what may be a cross fragment. At least that's what it seems to be telling us. And the inscription survives in 2 lines, the original orientation of which is not known, but it appears within framing lines that define the ground for the inscription. The form of the runes has more in common with those on the Isle of Man, and while dating based on such a small fragment is difficult, the majority of the Manx inscriptions are from between 930 and 1020 of the Common Era. Another Manx connection is that the stone commemorates someone with what was likely the Goidelic name Melmure, an Old Norse Celtic mix also frequently seen on the Isle of Man, most notably in inscription MM130 from Kirkmichael, which also mentions a Malmure. In September 2010, a plano-conical shaped lead spindle whorl with a runic inscription was found at Saltfleetby St. Clemens in Lincolnshire. Both its shape and material are typical for northern England between the 6th and the 10th centuries of the Common Era, with this particular find being dated to the early 11th century based on the runes. Its inscription extends in 2 rows, starting on the vertical wall of the whorl and then extending around the ring of the flat face. The runes themselves include a dotted E rune and a single-sided but still double-barred O grapheme that suggests an inscription from the early 11th century, hence the date. The inscription itself reads, Odin and Heimdallr and Thialfa, they help you, Ulfliot, and we can only guess so far what this last word means, but you will probably recognize an invocation of the Aesir gods Odin and Heimdall. From the 12th century, we have a baptismal font from Bridekirk in Cumbria. This mixed inscription includes both runes and a small number of vernacular Latin alphabet characters in a bookhand script that I've highlighted here in blue. The gamma-looking character here being a shorthand for the word and an Anglo-Saxon when rune in orange that just didn't exist in Scandinavia, but was part of the Anglo-Saxon Futhark. Catherine Holman highlighted the use of a long branch nauth, or N rune, in place of an E, which is only just starting to have an independent rune, a dotted E's. The inscription itself is a very sweet one. Rickard, he hath wrought me, and to this splendor brought me. Raymond Page pointed out that the language here is late Old English or early Middle English, with no sign of Nordic influence in the language, even if the runes show more of that evidence. We also have an inscription from Pennington on a semicircular arch, or tympanum, above the entrance to the parish church. Holman has read the first word as kumbel, or monument, but it could also be an abbreviated version of the Old Norse personal name Gamel, which is known from Cumberland place names and other local inscriptions. So this would not be a name out of place in the area, but it's a little surprising that it is so abbreviated in a patronage inscription. The runes, the name Gamel, and the possible patronymic Molson in this particular inscription, as well as the word kirk, are all Old Norse. The word order, fennekirk, and the use of the word set, or leta, are also Old English. So this may be what was spoken in the area, a combination of these languages, and simply a product of an area where multiple types of people of multiple ethnic backgrounds are all coming together. From the cathedral in Carlisle, we have two 12th century runic inscriptions. The first is simply a name, possibly Ragnvald, but the second is much more substantial, though perhaps not necessarily much more meaningful. Tolfin wrote these runes on this stone. Whereas the Saltfleetby whorl had a long branch sol or S rune, here we see a short twig variant with a dot. The word runar does end with a writhe rune, and we have two different instances of the tyr rune here. So Stein here has a short twig tyr rune, and the name Dolphin has a long branch version with branches on both sides of this stave. This difference may indicate that the spelling Tolfin might be meant to indicate the name Dolgfin, like the Dolgfin who was Bishop of Orkney from 1286 to 1309, known from the Icelandic annals. The distinction of the D sound from the T might be corroborated by a 13th century inscription from Conishead Priory, just outside Ulverton in Cumbria. The name begins with a very unique rune, a late dotted rune, which occurs in a form first on Sven Estridsen's coins between 1065 and 1075, though on Estridsen's coins, the branches in that rune are actually at the top of this stave, and the dots follow very closely underneath the branches, just like they do here, but here they are midway down this stave. The 14th century British Library additional manuscript 10374 also has Estridsen's D rune, and it gives the version with the branches midway down as the Anglo-Saxon syllable hey. Given the relative uniqueness of this rune, it may be quite difficult to be certain what sound it should make, but Dotbert is the accepted transliteration of the Conishead inscription. We even have a nearly full rune-row from Penrith on a brooch that is now at the British Museum, which gives us a lovely example rune-row from the Danelaw. If we supplement that with runes that show up in other inscriptions from this area to fill in alternate rune signs or allographs, we can collect the typical runes used by Younger Futhark rune writers of the Danelaw. Inscriptions in the northwest tend to use short twig S and T runes, whereas in the south and east they tended to use the long branch forms, with the greatest variability in the O sound rune. The Danelaw was a meeting place for multiple cultures, Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Scandinavian, and it makes sense that their runes reflect this mix. So thank you for reading the runes with me, the modern Erilar.